All right. So, yes, welcome everybody. I'm glad to see you here for the more boring part of the talk today. We're not going to be talking about colorful soldiery and wonderful garb and interesting dishes. Today, we are going to talk about books and dusty parchments, old libraries, and all the fun stuff that is the German culinary source tradition, and specifically the recipe source tradition. And what I'll be doing is I'll be talking about the general things that we know and introducing some of the more important pre-1600 sources. Not all of them. I thought that might be a good idea, but in all seriousness, I wasn't even able to finish compiling a list of all the sources that are by now edited. I do apologize for that. I was hoping to have a handout ready for you, but time was not on my side. There will be an introduction to many of the important sources. We will be looking at sample recipes from the most important ones, and I'll be talking about how to find and track down the less important ones, the odder ones, the more interesting ones. Or sometimes also just the outright more amusing ones, because there's some really weird stuff out there. Let me get started on my presentation. And I have to say right in advance that something seems to have gone wrong on the final save, and some of the slides have ended up with a background that they should not be having. So I hope that we'll be able to read most of it. I will improvise where we can't. Here we go. Recipe sources before 1600, the German corpus. Some of those are going to be familiar, some of those are not. And I'm also going to be talking about some sources for recipes that are not cookbooks in the strict sense, because we don't really get cookbooks until a great deal later than those. But there's some interesting stuff there. Now, what I'm not going to be talking about is the stuff that existed before there was a Holy Roman Empire, before there was a sense of a German language, because we have actually recipes that come from the soil of what would later become Germany that are earlier than that. Specifically, and most interestingly, one in the Hortulus of Walafrid Strabo, but by any stretch of the imagination, you can't really call that German. So I'm leaving it out for now, as the Lorsche Arzneibuch and a couple of other things. If you're interested in that, feel free to talk to me about this. The Walafrid Strabo is actually in the complete anachronist on Carolingian food that I did a couple of years ago. The Lorsche Arzneibuch, unfortunately, isn't. Right. Oh, great. Yeah. Sorry. It just says part 1, the manuscript tradition, and this picture is actually supposed to show up much, much later. So I'm sorry. I don't know what the computer did, but it decided that it made a nice background for this slide and a couple other ones. Okay, this one. Let's see if I can help with the highlight. No, not really. Sorry. Okay, you're just going to have to guess that what I'm telling you, you can read from this. All right. We have a fair amount of culinary references in German culture and literature from before we have cookbooks. Some of them are medicinal. Some of the earliest texts are medical texts. The Lorsche Arzneibuch has some references to food. The Marca Floridus has some references to food. Walafrid Strabo does, and of course Walafrid Strabo talks about gardens. We also have some references in poetry, in literature, but they are very, very scattered. They are quite rare, and the problem is that, very simply spoken, German poets who wrote in German didn't really do food references much by cultural choice. We know this because there's actually instructions to a poet about translating French poetry. German chivalric poetry is modeled very, very consciously on the French tradition, to the point that, for example, Wolfram von Eschenbach, a very famous poet, complained bitterly about the fact that he could write the most amazing German poetry, but he would never be as fashionable as somebody who just happened to speak French fluently, which he never mastered. But while French epic poetry does do food, lots of food references, German epic poetry, when translating from French or when taking over material from French, doesn't. And the instruction for the poet said that, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, where your original source speaks much of food, speak of gluttony. So basically, this concern with good food that was shown in the French literary sources was suspect. It wasn't quite acceptable to the chivalric poets. That's why those references are rare. We have some. As early as the 10th century in the Waltarius, which was originally written in Latin, but then very quickly translated into both Old High German and Old English, we have references to how to cook fish and how to cook porridge and things like that. Not real recipes, but definite guiding points. They are very useful. We have, that's another interesting thing, in the in another German poet, we understand that, number one, if you invite your defeated opponents after a tourney, then serving them roast chicken is the thing to do. And one chicken is considered a sufficient portion for 4 people. And the idea that one chicken for 4 people keeps going until pretty much post-period. So that is a cultural standard that doesn't seem to change. It also makes sense when you think of it. Early medical literature is relatively sparse, but there is something by the 13th century that we get, and that is books on table manners, texts on table manners. The very earliest text on table manners that we have in German is Der Welsche Gast. That's an interesting one. Was written in the late 12th century. An Italian, North Italian clergyman, Tommasino di Ceclaria, Tommasin von Cerclere, wrote a lengthy poem telling his German hosts in the most polite fashion he could manage that their manners were quite atrocious and that they really needed to up their game. Unfortunately, he doesn't talk all that much about table manners. It's just a small subsection of a much bigger text on the code of chivalric value. So it's not that interesting. The next one from the early 13th century is Tannhäuser's Tischzucht. I actually translated that one, so you can find it on my website now, and it is useful for all kinds of reconstruction purposes. And we should assume that the rules in there apply further back. They did not spring fully formed from the genius of Tannhäuser in the 1220s or whenever it was he actually wrote that thing. This is one thing I should probably say right now that we have the name of Tannhäuser here. In case you're not aware of this, Tannhäuser is pretty damn famous in German mythology. He's a poet. He wrote love poetry and chivalric poetry, and he is the eponymous hero of a Wagner opera. That's how famous he is. So Tannhäuser is a name that resonates with your average educated German, and did in the 13th century as well. So whoever wrote this text either figured that the name of Tannhäuser would go well with it, or whoever wrote it down figured that this looked so much like the work of the great Tannhäuser, who was, after all, an expert on all things that made men lovable, including good manners. Or it is possible that this text was actually really composed by Tannhäuser. The point is we don't know, and that will continue well into the 16th century, that German recipe sources, German culinary texts are sometimes associated with names, but we very rarely have any chance of assuring whether that association is real or spurious. Unlike with, for example, Taillevent or Maestro Martino of Como, all the names that we have before the middle of the 16th century in Germany are very, very tentative, and it's quite uncommon to be able to identify the person behind it. It's not that it hasn't been tried, it just doesn't work very well. Now let's get to actual recipe sources. Oh, thank you. Another background that, sorry, I really have no idea what my computer did here. But this is slightly better readable. The very first recipe source that we have, it comes out of a collection of books that is called as a Hausbuch. Michael de Leone, Michael de Loew probably, was a canon, a secular clergyman, and his Hausbuch, a book of all kinds of useful things, accounts, astrological treatises, and so on, includes a set of recipes. It starts out with a rhyme, but thankfully it's not actually written in rhyme, it's written in reasonable prose. It's called the Buch von guter Speise, the Book of Good Food. For a while, this Buch von guter Speise is as universal and as ubiquitous a title for recipe collections in German as Kitab al-Tabikh is in Arabic, or De Re Culinaria in Latin. It simply means basically a cookbook. And this is his. This is the one that he had written down. We have no idea who the author was. We have no idea where it was compiled or composed, but we know that it was something that this man considered useful, and we can tell from the way it readily makes reference to known dishes, to known processes, and to names of foods, that it is already standing on the basis of an established tradition. This is not Germany's first cookbook, it's merely the first one that we have surviving. It's very likely that the cooking tradition that produced these dishes at this point is several hundred years old. This book is actually interesting for being the starting point of a tradition. It gets translated into other dialects of German, it gets copied, and parts of it show up 100 years later in recipe books and recipe collections that combine different traditional strands. Because again, this is something that you have happening a lot in Germany. We don't have a founding tradition. Germany has no Martino. Germany has no Taillevent. There is no text that, no Viandier, there is no text that everybody writes down. There are several that appear to circulate, and bits and pieces of which show up in a variety of manuscripts. So what seems to be happening actually is that people who take an interest in recipe collections, and that appears to be mostly the people who eat, not the people who cook, but that's not different in other countries, exchange these recipes and compile their own recipe books, which suggests that German recipe collections, as they survive, reflect somebody's tastes and interests. It's just that very often we don't know whose. In this particular case, we happen to know the person who owned it, but again, we know so very little about him that it's not really a helpful data point. And that is also the background where most of the German recipe tradition comes from. It's people who are wealthy and influential, but not hugely so. Where in other countries you have recipe sources, recipe books that are associated with people like King Richard II or the Duke of Savoy. German recipe sources, where they are associated with people at all, tend to be associated with urban patricians, secular clergy of note, people like that. There are a few sources that are associated with seriously big names, with political heavyweights, but the association, wherever it comes up, appears to be quite spurious. There is very little to suggest that these books actually come from that background. Until the 16th century, the late 16th century, that's when we get German court cuisine for real. This is a recipe from the Buch von Guter Spiese, and I'm going to skip it because you can't actually read it. I'm sorry about that. Okay, and go on to the second big traditional line that we have, and that is the one that gets called sometimes the Meister Hans tradition. There's a problem with that. I will get to that in a moment. It's an awesome manuscript. I've worked on it. Part of it is up on my website, and I really, really would love to do the whole translation at some point. The manuscript is internally dated to 1460. The scribe was kind enough to put that date at the end of it. And it is ascribed, that is what it says on the very first page, to one Meister Hans. It's called Meister Hansen des zu Württemberg Koch, which means roughly Master Hans, who is cook to the Lord of Württemberg. At this point, mid-15th century, there are several lines of the House of Württemberg, so we are not entirely sure who, but Trude Ehlert, who edited the manuscript, actually tracked down references in the account books of the Duke of Württemberg to a cook, a man employed in the Duke's kitchen by the name of Hans. Can you see the problem with that? Hans is about as unusual a name at this point as John is in English. So if you have a large court establishment, it is absolutely certain that somebody's going to be called Hans. We don't know whether this Hans is the same person. There are two references. They are 40 years apart. It is possible that they're referring to the same person. It's possible that they're referring to different persons. It is possible that they are associated with this book, but all of that really is speculative. We don't know whether this person, this Master Hans, is a real person or not. I tend towards the assumption that this Master Hans is a real person, but that this book is associated with him only in a very tentative sense. Because, and that's the next thing, recipe parallels, recipes that occur in Meister Hans also occur in manuscript collections that predate the Meister Hans collection by 10 or 20 years. And we know that for sure. So possibility number one, what we have here is a copy of a copy of a copy of an actual book compiled by Master Hans. That is possible. Or this is a book of recipes that had already been in circulation and that were enriched with recipes that Master Hans was known to have produced, and that is now ascribed to it in its entirety. The book is pretty awesome. It's got 200 recipes in it, and they are in no particular order. It's basically a recipe. You take a recipe shaker and you just spill it out over the parchment, and that's Meister Hans. There are several duplicates. The same recipe shows up 2 or 3 times in different corners of the book, which is useful because it helps you to figure out what is actually meant. But it's also got some lovely other stuff. The recipes are intermingled with anecdotes, jokes, mnemonics. There is a rhyme that is the very earliest ancestor of the children's rhyme Backe, Backe, Kuchen, which is still current in Germany. And there are anecdotes, one of which I actually translated for an essay in the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery in 2016. Pretty interesting, where some cook, and I think that is the authentic voice of whoever this court cook is, this Meister Hans, describes how on a journey with his lord, he doesn't identify him by name, on a journey with his lord, he would come to a village and the only thing available was one calf. And now there comes this description, fairly inchoate, grammatically unstructured, but awesome, what they do with this one calf, how many dishes they make out of it and how they do it. The longest recipe in this collection is the last one. It's a subtlety, a showpiece garden with houses made of bread and gingerbread, with a fountain flowing wine, with a little automated drawbridge, with little figures, with trees made of meat. It's pretty impressive, and at some point I would really like to try it. This first person narrator that sometimes shows up is a really interesting one, because most of the recipes are in the standard recipe diction that we have from the very beginning. It's an imperative. It says, if you want to make this, do that. But some of the descriptions are actually in the first person. They say, I did this, I do that. That makes this book stand out. Down here, you have the link where you can find the recipes of the book that I've already translated and put up on my website. I would love to do more of that, but I'm currently busy with other projects, so it may be a while. Right. Thank you. Okay, and this is one of my favorite practical recipes from Meister Hans. A green sauce, make it thus and keep it. The green sauce or herb sauce is one of the perennial favorites of German medieval manuscripts. And I think, based on what I've read from Latin and Italian books and from the Arabic tradition, I think this may be a sauce tradition that goes back very, very far into the Dark Ages and the Roman times. Basically, you take herbs, you take vinegar or wine, and you take some thickening agent and spices, and then you make all of that into a sauce. He takes this one step further. Item, take sage and onions, parsley and sorrel, old and young. Pick the herbs and wash them and dry them in the sun. So this is a summertime activity. You go out, you pick your herbs, you wash them, you dry them. There are other recipes in later texts that detail how you should do this. You are supposed to collect morning dew by dragging linen or wool over the fresh grass. Then you are to wring it out, and you are to use that to steep the herbs in, to take out all the noxious humors, and then you are to dry them in the sun, grind them to a fine powder. Now come the spices. You take with that pepper, galangal, ginger, cinnamon, anise, coriander, subebs, cloves, mace, grains of paradise, and a little article. We have no idea what that is. It's been suggested that it's auricula. It's been suggested that it's artichoke. It's been suggested that it's simply a scribal corruption. We do not know. I've tried a couple of substitutions, but basically it works very well if you just leave it out. That makes the sage nice. I have no idea what makes the sage nice. Then you take dried white bread and make a powder of all of this. So what you're doing is you're taking spices and herbs and a little dried bread, pound it all to a powder and store it in your proverbial cool, dry place, because that stuff, when that stuff gets wet, it goes nasty. And when you wish to eat it, temper it with wine or with vinegar and keep this as long as you please. I can attest to its keeping qualities. I still have 2 packs of the batch I made for Drachenwald's autumn crown tourney, and it's still fine. So half a year is definitely on. I think longer than that. This is the first evidence we have for this particular recipe. It shows up in later texts there. Okay.
Pardon.
There are a couple of, yes, question.
There's a question in chat that asks, is this vastly different from Frankfurt green sauce?
Yes, very much so. Frankfurt green sauce probably belongs to the same tradition, but it's gone through several iterations. Your Frankfurt green sauce, the way that it is made these days, has a dairy base, sour cream or schmand or some kind of acidic dairy product. It gets mixed with eggs, and while the herbs differ, they all have a different flavor profile to this. I think we are looking at the same tradition, but I think we are looking at it through a lens past the 18th, 19th century through the lens that values richness and fatness. Because this green sauce that we have here, that cuts through fat. And that's why it works so well, for example, with roast pork and things like that. It's acidic, it's lean, and it's quite tart. Frankfurt green sauce adds richness to something that is otherwise quite bland. It tends to be served with boiled potatoes, which really can use that extra load of flavor carrying. So same tradition, but culinarily really opposite poles. Now talking about parallels a little bit, there are a couple of manuscripts, and thankfully they were actually edited, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to finish this up, edited by Doris Eichholzer in the book Willst du machen ein gut Essen? Three recipe collections that were produced in Austria. And two of them, the Dorotheen Kloster Cookbook and the Mondseer Cookbook, both of which come from monastic contexts, interestingly, have significant parallels with the Meisterhand tradition, and both predate the surviving Meisterhand's manuscript. Neither of them include the first-person narration or the anecdotes. That is why I think that we are looking at an established recipe collection that was ascribed to a person ex post facto, and then had material that is genuinely from that person added. Kind of like what happened with the Viandier and Taillevent. I mean, we know today that Taillevent didn't write the Viandier, but it tends to be associated with his name. A lot of these cookbooks, especially from Austria, come from monastic contexts. The reason for that is very likely not, as has been theorized for such a long time, that monks ate particularly well. That's a lovely bit of Catholic legendary that also gets used to explain why North German food sucks, which incidentally is something that everybody in Germany will be able to tell you, that North German food is just awful. If you want to eat good German food, you need to go to the south. You need to go to Württemberg, Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia. You do not want to go to Lower Saxony, to Schleswig, to Holstein, to Westphalia. And the idea is that that's because they closed the monasteries. And no, the reason that monastic contexts preserve cookbooks is that monastic libraries never throw anything away. A lot of cookbooks that existed in cities and noble residences very likely simply were lost to time. Monasteries kept them and usually never used them. Most of the medieval recipe collections that we have surviving from monasteries survive in unused condition. They were never good for anything. Okay, but going on from this, now we have another one, the Rein Fränkisches Kochbuch, that is again different, a standalone. And that was an expensive manuscript, and not just extensive, but expensive. It's not as big as the other ones, at just 76 recipes, but it's a nice one. It's beautifully made. It's written in a careful Gothic hand that already looks quite out of place in the mid-15th century. It has gilt initials. So this is a very expensively made book, not something practical. It was designed to impress. It was also edited for Tupperware Germany, so you can actually own a facsimile of it if you want. And this consists almost entirely of courtly cuisine. There are a few recipes that may not be out of place on a common table, but mostly this is really stuff that has high status. And again, you can get the translation at my website. It's on here, Rein Fränkisches Kochbuch. It's called the Rein Fränkisches Kochbuch because we can only place it by its dialect. It comes from the Rhine-Franconian, the Rhenish-Franconian dialect area, which is north of Württemberg, but south of Cologne, and in the Rhine-Main area rather than in the Upper Main Valley. It's a bit ironic that we don't know who this book was associated with, because from the effort that was put into producing it and the resources that were expended on it, I mean, it's written on parchment in the mid 15th century. If you're the mid 15th century, write something on parchment, you're doing it with a view to posterity. Practical, everyday, workaday stuff gets written down on paper at this time. Somebody really decided that it was time to preserve a cookbook with the same level of care, attention, and lavish display that you would normally expend on a psalter or a book of poetry. And I really wish we knew who that person was, but we don't. We have no idea who owned this. Probably belongs to some context of the nobility. That's all that we can say. And here is one of the simpler recipes from it, and one that I like very much. If you would make fritters of fresh cheese and cheese, this is an interesting one. Those two words, Züge and Käse, Züge und Käse, those we meet those again and again and again in the recipes, and there clearly is a distinction. In modern Swiss German, the distinction is whether the cheese is made from milk that is that's just skimmed, or whether it is made from buttermilk. Züge is buttermilk cheese, but we don't know whether that was that way in the Middle Ages. Some other sources, and I've looked into this, I've tried to resolve this, some other sources suggest that Züge is cheese made by an acidic separation method, by acidic way, while Käse is made with rennet. Again, this is not a consistent usage. So whatever the distinction is that this author makes between Züge and Käse, it is important to him, but we don't really know it. Make a dough of flour and of fresh cheese in equal amounts, break eggs into it, color it, and see that the dough be thick. What you're making here is something about the thickness of a noodle dough or a spätzle batter. And then comes the part that is really interesting. Afterward, take a plate and place a ladleful of the dough on it. Scrape it off lengthwise with a knife into hot fat, and you will have fine fritters. Serve them with sugar. If you know how to traditionally make spätzle, this is exactly how. This is the skill that sets apart the real Swabian housewife from any imposter like me who uses machinery for that. You can buy all kinds of machines that make spätzle for you, or that you can use to make making spätzle easier. But if you really know what you're doing, you slice it off of a wet board with a knife right into the boiling water. This is exactly how you make fritters here. I admit I've never tried. I'm not that good with knives. I value having all my fingers, but it's an interesting recipe. Right. Here's another one that caught my attention early on, and that I actually translated years ago and am getting ready to go over again because I made so many embarrassing mistakes back then. It's the Teutonic Order manuscript, or Königsberg manuscript. It's a fragmentary collection. It also has parallels with the Meister Hans tradition, but that's not surprising because it clearly doesn't come from anywhere near Königsberg. The dialect places it in South Germany, Southwest Germany. So pretty much exactly where Meister Hans' tradition comes from. The Teutonic Order, we have an enormous amount of documents from the Teutonic Order. I mean, this is not a solitary thing. We have pretty much the entire archive of the Teutonic Order from the 14th and 15th centuries. We have things like purchase books that indicate what kind of sweets the Grand Master of the Order liked to eat. And it's really fascinating. And all of that is in Low German. The business of the order was conducted entirely in Low German, Westphalian Low German. This is clearly something in a foreign language that somebody brought in. We have no idea how it ended up there, but it suggests, again, how these texts could circulate. And somebody thought it interesting, they put it in a library, and they completely forgot about it until someone in the 1920s dug it up, edited it, and published it just in time for the Second World War to start, because the original is lost. And that's another story that will repeat itself again and again with the German recipe corpus. The original is lost. It may be held in Berlin, and if I ever have the time and the energy to actually do that, I will go there and try to find out if that's true. Because the original editor was very enthusiastic, but just not terribly good at it. And this is two recipes from the Königsberg manuscript. And again, recipes that I find repeated again and again in the German corpus and that are interesting for Mörserkuchen, mortar cake. If you want to make a good mortar cake, cut white bread into dice, break eggs into pieces and put the bread into it. Cut nutmeg and mace into it and make it yellow with saffron. Yellow means saffron most of the time, although the Innsbruck manuscript, another one that I haven't been able to include here, there is one cooking manuscript that actually makes reference to Gelbwurz, which means turmeric. Typically, that is used in fabric dyeing in the 15th century, but it is used in on one occasion in Germany for food, for making it yellow. So now you know that. So cut nutmeg and mace into it and make it yellow, cut fried chicken into it, though you may also use livers or stomachs or feet. Meat, basically. Place it on the embers, pour the filling into it, and let it bake and serve it forth. What you are supposed to place on the embers is your metal mortar. That is a cooking method that is very, very popular in Germany. You take a metal mortar, you grease it, you heat it, and then you put something in it and bake it in there. The second one, you grind white bread finely, beat eggs into it and make it yellow, season it well, cut nutmeg and mace into it. You put lard in a mortar, put it in the embers and pour it in there. And when it is baked, you cut it in slices. I've tried this. It's undistinguished. It's not bad, but what made it popular apparently is really that it was a bit of a status marker as a side dish. You could put mortar cake on the table that meant that you had a mortar. Not everybody did. Very far from everybody had a mortar. And the method is extremely popular. And it works. I mean, mortars like that kind of like work like Dutch ovens. They conserve heat very well. Okay, here's another one that's interesting, the Mittelniederdeutsches Kochbuch, or Wismar manuscript, or Wolfenbüttel manuscript. Today held at Wolfenbüttel, which thankfully was not liberated by the Russians, therefore survives. It's the only surviving Low German manuscript source of recipes that we have to date. There is also one surviving book of manners, the Wahre Hofeschheid, which probably dates to roughly the same time, late 15th, early 16th century. And I translated that one for the Tournaments Illuminated a couple of years ago. The Mittelniederdeutsches Kochbuch has 103 recipes. And it's interesting because some of the recipes have parallels in South German traditions, in the Meister Hans tradition, but some of its recipes have parallels in the harper-strang tradition, which otherwise happens strictly in Scandinavian languages. So some of the harper-strang manuscripts, Libellus de Arte Culinaria recipes, show up in this book. Again, it suggests how these recipes were put together. The German recipe tradition doesn't have a high regard for the text as a whole. They kind of mix and match. Here's one of my favorites. It comes from neither the harper-strang nor the Meister Hans. It is unique to, not unique, but it is original to this one, to this source. It's a good puree of apples. You put the apples in an earthen cookpot, unpeeled, and let them bake in an oven. And they shall be, very usefully, Goderlinge or Flageäppele. Unfortunately, we don't actually know what types of apples these are. The landrace does not survive. When they are baked, pass them through a doorslag, a colander. Next, pass them through a good clean cloth. Then set them to the fire and let it boil. Add honey and pounded rice. Sorry, my autocorrect. That's supposed to be sears, not searched, through a spice sieve, a krudeset. Also add saffron, ginger, and cloves and pepper. You may keep this puree for a long time. If you actually cook this long enough, you're not adding any liquid to it, other than the honey. You're adding spices and rice as a binder. And if you cook this for long enough and thoroughly enough, you've effectively got something sterile that will quickly set, and then you can keep this stuff pretty much forever. And it's quite tasty. Apfelmus, by the way, gets mentioned in the 16th century as the kind of provisions that a prudent housewife has for long-term storage. We're probably looking at pretty much this. Okay. And then we also have a large number of minor fragments. I translate some of them every now and then. They tend to show up bound with medical and astrological texts in your typical Hausbücher. Some were clearly produced by named individuals. Others were designed as recipe collections associated with names, even though they pretty clearly are not entire collections. And one library, the Munich Staatsbibliothek, went through its manuscript store, picked out all those minor fragments that they had and had them edited. And that's the Tupperware Deutschland, the Münchner Kochbuchhandschriften aus dem 15. Jahrhundert. All the small recipe collections that they have, all these little things that will never make it into a book on their own, got edited for that particular book. And I really highly recommend it. It's fascinating. I did one of them, the Bohemian manuscript, so CGM 349. And again, you will find it on my website, but there are many more like that. And again, this is interesting. These minor fragments that show up so frequently, very often they are themed. For example, the one that I did includes recipes that are supposedly from Bohemia and Hungary. Makes sense. Okay. Then a couple of other things. This is one of my earliest encounters, is the Meister Eberhard. Meister Eberhard is another High German manuscript. It's 113 entries. It's quite substantial. It was produced in the second half of the 15th century. Though if we go by the ascription, one Master Eberhard claims to be a cook in Landshut. Bayern Landshut is one of the Bavarian dukedoms. If that was true, then he probably wants to be associated with the Dukes of Landshut of the early 15th century. But we don't have a Meister Eberhard in the court records of Landshut. The book clearly does not come from a court cook. Most of it consists of dietetic advice that is fairly generic. The recipes are in there, but not a whole lot. What is interesting is that this text includes, among an awful lot of other quotations that are unascribed, a quotation from Hildegard Spingensis that is unascribed. Now, you would think that this wasn't in any way special, because clearly you would quote an authority on health and food. But the thing is, in the 15th century, Hildegard von Bingen wasn't an authority. In the 15th century, as far as we know, practically nobody knew about Hildegard von Bingen. But somehow a quote from the Physica of Hildegard von Bingen made it into a recipe collection from the 15th century. And we have no idea how, but it's a really interesting detail that I didn't want to keep from you. Meister Eberhard is one of the ones that I will go through again, and it will then go up on my website once I have re-edited it. And this is one of the Meister Eberhard recipes. If you want to make 3 dishes out of 1 fish, take a pike. It is always a pike. But don't let that scare you. Pike is ridiculously expensive. It was ridiculously expensive back then. This kind of thing works with just about any large fish. Wrap a wet cloth around its middle part and lay it on a griddle. Salt it and let it roast. And the front part you must dust with flour and pour more lard over. Pour hot wine over the cloth and the hide part roasts by itself on the griddle. So what you have is basically a fish, the front of which is fried, the middle of it is steamed, and the back part is grilled. That recipe is not unusual. It shows up throughout the German tradition. I haven't found it anywhere else yet. It shows up everywhere in the German tradition, and it's a showy dish. I'm sure they made it. I'm sure they loved it. They showed off. There are a couple of different ways of doing it. Some recipe books suggest 4 ways of cooking. Some recipe books suggest that you need to first cook the fish, take out the bones, mix it as a filling, and make it into a gefilte fish, and then treat it like that. Some recipe books suggest cutting the fish apart, cooking it 3 ways, and then putting it back together and hiding the connecting points under dough strips, which is a bit of a cheat. But clearly this recipe was popular enough for cheats like that to develop and for variations like that to develop. It makes a beautiful centerpiece to any German feast you would care to make. And it highlights another thing that we know about German cuisine. German cooks or German culinary connoisseurs, German eaters, or whether somebody in Germany was reading Arabic sources, because this recipe, not word for word, but this exact technique is found in Al-Barak, in the 10th century Arabic cookbook. And you can't tell me that that just happened. I mean, you know, if you're going to tell me that the Olmecs built pyramids and the Egyptians built pyramids, so they clearly had connection, the fact that there is a pyramid does not necessarily suggest connection, but this is a very specific way of treating a fish. I am pretty convinced that there's a cultural context somewhere along the way. I haven't been able to trace it because it probably happened at a time when when we don't have any surviving cookbooks. They didn't write down recipes to that extent. But I'm pretty sure this is as solid as it gets for cultural contact with the Arabic-speaking world. Okay, and here's another example for that. The German Liebe der Ferkulis. Sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, an otherwise undistinguished scholar named Jambombinos Cremonensis, translated an Arabic recipe collection, which was a fairly straightforward one. It was actually been identified by now. It is the Minhaj al-Bayan. I don't know anything about the original text. I haven't been able to follow it up yet for want of time, and I'm also just not that conversant with the tradition. I don't read Arabic, so I'm dependent on translations anyway. But he translated an Arabic recipe collection into Latin. And at some point, this got translated into Middle Upper German, to Bavarian. And this book is now held in the Bavarian State Library. It's a fascinating text because it contains Arabic recipes by their Arabic names. Very frequently, the author uses names that are clearly derived from Arabic and that mean nothing to him to define other terms clearly derived from Arabic that equally mean nothing to him. Most of the recipes cannot be replicated in a kitchen of medieval Germany, even if you tried, because where are you going to get bananas? But that wasn't the point. This is not a cookbook that was actually meant to be used. This was considered useful medical knowledge. As late as the 15th century, understanding your medical texts meant understanding your Arabic cooking tradition. And this was something that people did. Right. Incidentally, the very latest edition of this, I put it in here, das Frühneuhochdeutsche Buch von den Kosten und seine Wurzeln im lateinischen Liebe der Ferkulis und im arabischen Minhaj al-Bayan in synoptischer Edition mit Übersetzung und überlieferungskritischem Kommentar. That book was produced at the University of Graz, which is doing a lot of really awesome research on medieval cooking tradition lately, and is free to download. I love European scholarship. So just, you know, grab it. Even if you don't read German, you're still going to get some Latin and Arabic that you may be able to work with. There is also an Italian tradition. In case you're looking for that, it goes for ridiculous prices on the second-hand market these days. And that takes us to the end of the 15th century. Are there any questions now? Because we're going to go over to print very soon.
There was one question in chat requesting
Yes, I'm trying to find it.
the German for recipe 81.
For recipe 81, that was the grüne Salz.
Yes.
Yeah, this one. I don't have it on hand. I would have to dig it out. I usually posted only the translations because of otherwise it would become unreadable. But I will dig it out, I promise.
Excuse me, I shared the link to that one in chat because I just typed down all the links that you're having. I shared that one in chat, so if someone will just scroll back up, they can.
All right. Okay, thank you. All right. Now, before we come to the end of the manuscripts, we are at the very verge of the Renaissance and the age of print, but that doesn't mean that manuscripts stop being relevant. And this is a reminder of this. We have a chance survival from the first half of the 16th century of no fewer than 3 manuscript recipe collections, all of them pretty massive, associated with 2 patrician families of just one city. Now, that can mean one of 2 things. Either the city of Augsburg in the 16th century was a hotbed of culinary innovation. And these 3 women in particular were its escoffiers, or more likely, this is the level of density of material that we had, and that has been lost in most other places. Because typically when you're looking for a recipe collection that covers a regional cuisine of any given place, maybe you're going to find something that was 50 years out of date and 200 kilometers away, and that's as close as it gets. Here for Augsburg, you have no fewer than 3 recipes that were produced within about 20 years of each other, as far as we can tell. 2 of them come from the Welser family. And one of them, the cookbook of Sabina Welser, has been translated. It's part of Caryatics Miscellany. So you can find all of that online. The Sabina Welser cookbook has also seen a reasonably good and very thorough museum edition. It's a tiny little pocketbook, and it's still in print. So you can get this, which is wonderful, but it's also available online. You can download it. You can do your own stuff. Sabina Welser is a member of the Welser family. The Welser family was rich. And when we say rich, we need to understand that we're not talking he owns a car dealership rich. We're not talking he dabbles in the stock market rich. We're talking seriously rich. That family was in banking in a very big way. When the Spanish crown found itself unable to pay back the debts that they owed the Welser, in exchange for the forgiveness of the interest payments on the debt, not forgiveness of the principal, forgiveness of the interest payment on the debt, they left them Venezuela. The Welser family pretty much outright owned Venezuela at the time. That's how seriously rich we're talking. This is a family that single-handedly financed an operation of colonization and genocide for profit, which didn't work out, by the way. They found nothing in Venezuela worth stealing, but they had that kind of money. We don't know who Sabina Welser was. We know that there were 2 women in the family of that name, neither distinguished historically in any way. We don't know which is the one that this is associated with. The other member of the Welser family, Philippine Welser, who also left us a recipe book, married a Habsburg prince and reigned as Archduchess of Tyrol later in life. The recipe book probably dates to the time when she was still in Augsburg, but we're not entirely sure. Her court was famous for paying attention to culinary art. Her court in Tyrol was famous for good food and a well-run kitchen, and we will meet one of its graduates later on. The third one is the cookbook of Maria Stengler. Maria Stengler, again, is not known to history. The Stengler family were one of the less than stellarly wealthy patricians, but again, I mean, compared to the Welser, everybody's poor. And again, the original is lost. We don't know where it went. It was in the city archives, and then it wasn't. It survives only in a 19th century edition. And when I say 19th century edition, I say that in the kindest of terms. The recipes look plausible. The language is clearly modern High German. And the introduction that this book comes with, while mock Middle German, is so clearly a 19th century fake. This is sad, unfortunately, but still, the recipes work. You can use them as parallels for bolstering other things, and they have significant numbers of parallels with the Welser tradition. So this visibly, palpably comes from the same place. These three are really interesting survivals. This is one of the recipes in Philippine Welser, yellow rice porridge. Take rice, boil it well in almond milk, toss it through a cloth as sugar, make it yellow, return it to the pot, let it boil, stir it often so it does not burn. That's serious wealth. Rice, almond milk, sugar, and saffron. Yeah, that's upscale. This is Sabina Welserin. If you wish to make good salted tongues, these are best made in January. That way they stay good throughout the entire year. First, take 25 tongues, or as many as you wish. Take one after the other and beat them and before and behind on chopping block. That way they are made long. And grind up salt and coat the tongues in it. Take a nice cask, lay salt into its bottom, lay the tongues into it, and at first side by side, then salt again until it is all white from the salt, and so on. One layer of tongues, one of salt until you put it all in. Then you must press it so that the brine covers it, and after it has stood for 50 days, hang them in the smoke for 4 days. Then they are done enough. Afterwards, they hang exposed to the air. The recipe works. It's been tried. I have tried it. It's a good one. But again, it comes from the kind of family where 25 beef tongues are something you can easily get. Do the maths in your head. Where are you going to get 25 beef tongues on the same day? Yeah. And this is from the Stenglerin. To fry tart cherries so that the batter remains white. Take nice flour, mix the batter with cold water and beat it well like the dough for a yeast cake until it shows bubbles. That's a very interesting point about the yeast cake. Make it runny with pure egg white like any other batter for cherries. You use egg white because it's supposed to stay very light. Tie the cherries well together at the tops of their stems so they spread apart at the bottom because they grow large and bubbly. That's good advice. Have your fat as hot as possible and only dip them in and take them out again. So what you do is you take cherries on the stalk, you dip them in this very light batter, and then you dip them quickly in fat. That was an extremely popular thing to do in German cuisine, and every other cookbook has loads of recipes for batter dipped stuff. This has some interesting technical details, and that is what I mean when I say the recipes ring true. Another lost original, the Leipzig Klosterkochbuch. In a Dominican monastery ruin in Leipzig, allegedly, was found in the early 19th century, at the height of the Gothic fashion, an old tattered manuscript that contains recipes. It survived in a 19th century edition, again, of the same dubious quality as the Stenglerin. The original manuscript is now lost. And we could deplore that and think maybe the author was being liberal with the truth, or maybe it actually existed until it was lost. Maybe it still exists somewhere. For all we know, it could be mislabeled and stuck in some file of tax receipts from 1823 by now. The problem is the recipes of the Kloster Kochbuch, which, by the way, a friend of mine is working on translating, so that should be coming out sometime this year. It's Duke Vitus, who usually hits people on the head with sticks, but also takes an interest in cooking, has clear parallels right down to the wording, recipes in the late 16th century Oikonomia by a clergyman, Johannes Kohler, a print book that I didn't include here because it really becomes relevant for the 17th century, but you can find excerpts from it on my website. And that really makes no sense if the story of the Kloster Kochbuch is true. And this was a ratty old manuscript found in the ruins of a Dominican monastery that was secularized in the 1520s. Then there is no way that a Lutheran clergyman in the Mecklenburg countryside was able to get his hands on that text. So the charitable interpretation is that we have a print tradition that is lost. There was a printed text that this manuscript was based on, and that we no longer have, but that Kohler had access to. That's completely plausible. A lot of German printed cookbooks were produced in tiny editions. Germany did not have a centralized printing industry the way France or Britain did, or England did. Print shops were in every town and they all produced whatever they could. But an alternative explanation would be that the author of the 19th century edition let his imagination run wild and produced this idea that, oh, I found this ancient manuscript in the ruins of a Dominican monastery, and you would not believe what it says. That probably sold much, much better than, I found this old printed pocketbook in the back of a secondhand bookshop, and it's from the mid-16th century, and here are the recipes. I totally believe that that's what happened. Again, you can still buy the Kloster Kochbuch. The photomechanic reproductions of the original 19th century print are so common because some publisher in East Germany bought the rights to them, that you can literally pick one up for €3 online. The edition sucks though. Right, part 2, printed sources. This is going to be short, I promise. The very first cookbook that was printed in Germany was the very second cookbook that was printed anywhere in Europe, the Küchenmeisterei, which means the mastery of the kitchen. It was first printed in Nuremberg in 1485. And it was such a runaway success that not only were several manuscript copies produced, Trude Ehlert, who also edited a lot of other really interesting stuff, went through them, edited 2 of the better manuscript copies of the Küchenmeisterei and compared them to the print, but that it was reprinted literally from 1486 onwards, almost every year for 10 years, and then regularly for over a century, with changes and additions, because that's the fate of German prints, but regularly, because this is how that works. Again, no centralized printing industry. Print shops do not usually have large capital at their disposal. There is no German plantain. Instead, they produce a small print run of something and hope that it sells. And if it does, other print shops produce pirated versions. And that's exactly what happened to this one. The Küchenmeisterei appears again and again under different titles. In some cases, and that's an interesting one, it gets ascribed to Platina. There are German prints from the 1510s, 1520s that are sold under the name of Platina, but contain the recipes of the Küchenmeisterei. Neat. The Küchenmeisterei has over 200 entries. Not all of them are strictly speaking recipes. There are medicinal preparations, dietetic advice, and so on. And I have a piece of good news for you. Somebody translated the Küchenmeisterei, and it's going into print. There's a forthcoming translation, probably this summer, that comes out with Ellipsis imprints of Durham, and it'll be available at a very reasonable price in both print and ebook edition, just as soon as the proofreader's finished with it. Your piece of good news for the day. And this is a recipe from the Kuchenmeisterei, flappy fritters. Yeah. Make a stiff dough with eggs and wine, and the third part is milk. So wine and milk as the liquid, eggs, and of course, flour. Draw it out on a board and roll it out with a rolling pin. So it's a fairly thick, yeah. Made of white flour clearly does not refer to the rolling pin, but to the dough. The Kuchenmeisterei is clearly being produced in haste. As we say in German, it was knitted with a hot needle, and you can tell it, yeah. Not too thin or too thick, long and narrow. Make flat sheets called Lappen, which is in modern German the word for a dishcloth. Of it, nicely twisted on the tips or shaped in front like oak leaves or linden leaves, what shapes you wish. So you can just about imagine somebody cutting out leaves. Yeah? If you want them brown, fry them well. If you want them yellow, make the dough with saffron mixed in wine, or with milk, green with parsley juice, or whatever else colors things green, or blue from cornflowers. These flappy fritters are good to eat with all kinds of sauces as a roast course. So this is actually pretty nice and very, very beautiful to look at if you have these different colored autumn leaves. You have a plate full of autumn leaves in different yellow, orangey, red, or greenish colors. And then you dip them in sauce and you eat them. It's just beautiful. And nowadays, of course, you don't have to shape them by hand. You can get cookie cutters that are shaped like leaves. I made those. They were awesome. Okay. German cooking also took an interest beyond its borders. In 1533, a German translation of the Tarquinum Sanitatis appeared in Strasbourg that was very successful. And in 1542, finally, the German market got an actual Platina translation rather than another fake. German printing practices were not terribly ethical, but this translation is actually a good one. I compared it. It is good. And then we get the next star of the German cookbooks, Balthasar Steindel's Sehr nützliches und künstliches und nützliches Kochbuch, the very artful and useful cookbook. The first edition was in 1544. That is practically unavailable nowadays. When I do Steindl, I have to take recourse to an edition that's almost 20 years later. Steindl also was reprinted throughout the 16th century, again and again and again. His focus is on representative cuisine, showy dishes, nice food that shows off, unobtrusively shows off your status. And he likes to play with his food. And he's got good diction. This is a very nice cookbook. Definitely didactically and organizationally a step forward from the Kuchenmeisterei. Very, very clearly. Here's what he does. To make an almond cheese that has as many colors as you like, you pour the above mentioned colors. He talks about how to make colors with corn flour and saffron and spinach and stuff into a cup. Let it gel 1 finger high, then pour more of another color on top. Never hot, only cold. They do not mingle. Pour in as many colors as you like until the cup is full. So you have almond milk with isinglass and colored, and then you make layers. And when it is all boiled and gelled, dip the cup in hot water, take it out again and invert it over a plate. Then you have all the colors. You can imagine this as the centerpiece of a dessert course or something. It's just pretty. And that is something you find. He does a lot of that. He also has bowls of white jellied almond milk where you cut heraldic patterns into it and fill the gaps with colored almond milk so that you have heraldic plates and platters and stars and flowers and stuff. He's very much into that. Okay. Around the same time, you've got 2 really interesting guys, Walter Riff, a medical writer, and Hieronymus Bock, a physician and botanist. Walter Riff produced, I think basically as an aside, he seems to have had to make his living as a writer, which is a very, very sad state of affairs, I should know. An alphabetical list of foods and their properties, which was marketed to bourgeois households. And it's got some interesting things in it. but Hieronymus Bock is by far more interesting. He was a noted physician and a notable botanist who published in Latin. But in 1550, incensed by the fact that so many Germans liked Italian food so much, he wrote the German Larder, the Teutsche Speisekammer, a patriotic defense of German food as absolutely the best in the world. That guy is absolutely horrible, by the way. If you read this, what's the male equivalent of a Karen? Anyway, he comes across hyper-patriotic, rich, entitled, narrow-minded, and extremely classist. He's probably also racist, except he never really mentions anybody else. And he has this to say about contemporary fashions. In the kitchens today, all dishes and courses and all beverages have to be salted or cooked with sugar. How healthy such foods and beverages are, I will leave for everyone to find out for himself. Myself, I regard such food and drink as unhealthy, notwithstanding that there is a saying, probably made in the kitchen, that reads that no food could be spoiled with sugar. Zucker verdirbt kein Essen is actually recorded in Agricola's collection of German idioms. So yes, that existed. And he's not happy with the fashion for sugar, which around 1550 really gets going because you have Canary sugar, Pernambuco sugar, you have the very first beginnings of large-scale sugar production coming back to Europe. And the chapter continues with talking about the different grades of sugar, where they are sourced, what makes them special, what you do with this or that kind of sugar. He doesn't have recipes most of the time, a very, very few entries that could qualify, but he has an awful lot to say about all kinds of foods that is very, very interesting, if you can stand his style. What we haven't seen anything of so far is Switzerland, and there's a reason for that. The Swiss upper classes speak German at home, but they really read Latin. And there is an output of culinary texts from Switzerland, but it's in Latin. In 1563, Jodocus Willich produces the Ars Magirica hoc est coquinaria, etc., etc., etc. It's a lengthy title. You can see where you can download it. And if you read Latin, that's a very rewarding book. It's got really interesting recipes in it, some of them much earlier recorded than they are elsewhere. And it's also culturally a contact point, because this is where the French, the Italian, and the German sphere overlap. And then Konrad Gessner. Do I need to introduce Konrad Gessner? He's like the Richard Attenborough of his day. Wrote Libellus de Lacte, the Book of Milk, where he describes everything you can do with milk. 1541 in Zurich. Both of these books are absolutely fascinating reading, but of course, neither of them is in any meaningful way German. The first German language recipe collection that is published in Switzerland is actually published in the 17th century. Before that time, it's all books produced in southern Germany. At the other end of the German language line, we have Low German. And we actually have two surviving Low German print cookbooks. The Cookery, Lübeck, 1570, by Johann Ballhorn, and Dat kleine Kakebuch, Hamburg, circa 1580, by Joachim Löw. Both of those books heavily riff on the Kuchenmeisterei. Neither is an outright copy. Dat kleine Kakebuch is about 80% Kuchenmeisterei, the Cookery about 50%. But clearly both are derivative works. What makes them interesting is not the recipes in there. They are fairly standard, except for one or two that are mildly interesting. What makes them interesting is the format they are in. These are cheap, little, bitty pieces of paper. They are not even paperback books. They are like 20 or 30 pages. South German printers produce cookbooks at this point that are pretty massive tomes. They're hefty books. You can hold them in both hands. You can caress them, sniff them, do all the book lover things. These, they feel more like an opera leaflet. But that was apparently the format that sold in North Germany. Two more were recorded in 1938 in a census of North German culinary texts by Hans Wismar. who was just getting ready to edit them when World War II started. And yeah, you know what comes next. As an interesting aside, recipes from both the cookery and the kleine cookbook made it into the first Danish language cookbook that was published in 1616, which is also derivative of the Kuchenmeisterei. That thing never goes away. Here's a recipe from the cookery, and the link underneath, because I also translated the cookery, so you can get that from my website. You take an ox tongue, stick it with cloves and cinnamon. You stick it on a spit and you let it roast, drizzle it with butter and spice powder. Unfortunately, spice powder is not defined. And when it is done, cut it along in the middle and place it in a wooden bowl. Take a cook pot and put in it wine, sugar, cinnamon, spice powder, pepper, brundok, and currants. Let it boil together and pour it over the tongue. That's a spicy meat in a sweet spicy sauce, very Renaissance. It's good. I did it. The interesting thing is brundok. I have no idea what that is. I have a suspicion, but the problem is that the cookery, of course, was made by Johann Ballhorn. And Johann Ballhorn is famous. To this day, German has the word verballhornen, which means to so badly mangle a word in writing or print that it becomes unintelligible. He was famous for that. So whatever brundok originally was, once Ballhorn got his hands on it, we will probably never know, sadly. Now we come to the end of our journey and we meet the giant, Max Rumpold. There is a multi-year project to translate Rumpold in the works that I hope to see the end of, and it is awesome. I did not touch Rumpold because that project had been going on for a long time, and it's really an amazing book. Max Rumpold was personal cook to the Archbishop Elector of Mainz, and that, for the first time, is an absolutely credible statement. We know a lot about him from his own cookbook, a few things from other records, but really most of his life comes from his writing, and it's plausible. He also records, among other things, that he learned his trade in the kitchens of the Archduke of Tyrol, which links him to Philippine Welser, who was Archduchess of Tyrol at the time. And in 1581, towards the end of his professional life, he published ein neues Kochbuch, a new cookbook. It's well over 1,000 recipes. It's an incredibly elaborate edition with copious illustrations. It's a highly fashionable court cuisine with all the latest stuff in it. It includes anecdotes and lots of first-person narration and lots of very strongly worded opinions. He's got a description of what the perfect head cook is like, and you can just see him preening in front of the mirror while he does that. But this guy has every reason to be vain. The recipes are really very, very good. This is the front page of the 1581 edition. And again, you can find it online, you can download it. And you can see that the title is quite long. Max Rumpold kurfürstlich-mainzischen Mundkoch. He actually got an imperial privilege that for 10 years, he would be the only person allowed to reproduce that book because he understood how the book market worked. What he did not understand is that most printers didn't really care. Rumpold, again, gets reprinted again and again and again. And that illustration is, of course, famous. That is Rumpold. That is the master cook in his kitchen. That is supposed to be prime Rumpold. And incidentally, if you know anything about 16th century German clothing, you can tell that that is not the fashion of the 1580s. That's the fashion of the 1520s. A lot of German woodcut art is kind of stuck in the age of Dürer for 100 years. So whatever woodcuts you see from the 1560s, from the 1580s, from the 1590s, you need to watch out for that. The stuff just reproduces a certain genre of clothing, a certain genre of interior, even if actual fashion has moved on. Here we have a recipe for a Fürhess. You take from the hare, the whole forepart cooked in a black sauce with onions. You take the forepart, that is the shoulders, the four paws and the head. You cut it into pieces, take water and vinegar, you catch the blood. strain it over this. You cut onions and apples into it and a little bread. You let it oil boil together, take it out, and pass the blood sauce through a hair cloth so that it becomes rather thick. You fry the onions in pork lard, season them with pepper and cloves, add them to the blood, and let them boil with it. When you pre-fry the onions, they dissolve more easily and you get Maillard flavors. It's a very good technique that is very common in 16th century German cooking. Clean out a pot, put the blood sauce into it and let it cook till it is done. Make it nicely sour and not sweet because hares are not good when they are sweet. You can make a sauce of apples or almonds to go with it, or strew triget. Triget is a sweet spice mix over it. This is again a fairly typical recipe for the German corpus, a blood-thickened spicy sauce for meat pieces, Fürhess or Füressen. And Rumpold's instructions, as you can see here, are very concise and very practiced. You can tell that he does this quite regularly. And then we have the copycat, 1598, Franz de Roncier. He was cook to the Duke of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel. His Kunstbuch von mancherlei Essen has even more recipes than Rumpold, but unfortunately they are so short that they are almost useless. Some are nice, and what it really makes an interesting comparison with is Rumpold at this point is old. He is in 1580, is at the end of his professional life. The Roncier is relatively new. Rumpold's culinary vocabulary is largely Italian and Spanish. The Roncier's is French. This is where that change begins to happen. Unfortunately for everybody who wants to work with this, there is a reprint that dates to 1990, but no online scan. Nobody has put the Roncier online, which makes me very, very unhappy. Because that's a really interesting text, and I wish it was more widespread for that particular reason. The recipes are all standard. He doesn't even have guinea pig. Rumpold has guinea pig. He has something like 12 recipes for guinea pig because he's a mad completist and he's basically going, okay, somebody's going to want to eat those, so that's what you do. Roncier does not have guinea pig. And we have the last one, Anna Wecker. Anna Wecker was the widow of the noted physician Johann Jakob Wecker, who was the author of several books on medicinal preparations. She wrote in 1597, the year of her death, Ein köstlich neu Kochbuch, a delightful new cookbook, with a focus on invalid cookery. And that book was intended probably as a fairly simple thing. You know, the wife of a noted doctor sharing what she knows about cooking for the sick. Her recipe descriptions are awesome. She's got a great eye for technique. She describes in great detail, repetitive as all get out, but very fascinating. You can learn the ins and outs of a 16th century kitchen from her in a way that you can't from any other source. And this book, again, was reprinted from 1597 onwards pretty much every year until 1600, and for many years after. It's a standard of the German kitchen throughout the 17th century. And here is a recipe from her, and as you can see, they are long. This is a hearty dish of dried, it's basically noodles. You take eggs, as many as you like, the yolk is best, and you add pepper, ginger, saffron, nutmeg, and mace, together with all kinds of good spices that please you. You salt it a little and you stir it into a dough with good flour. If it is not strong enough with spice it, season it more, as long as it's not strong enough. You want this to be fairly strong. It should be very dry. If you would have a little sugar in it, that's your choice. When she says that is your choice, you need to read it as it's your funeral. Then work it as dry as you can. Yeah, a very dry pasta dough. Roll it or twist it into thin ribbons about as thick as a proper knife's bag. Make it as thin as wood shavings, Hobelspäne. That's an internal reference. Hobelspäne is a particular confection that she describes earlier on, or very finely cut root vegetables. Roll out the ribbons 3 or 4 fingers wide, then cut them across. That way you get different lengths. Lay it out on paper sheets and place it in a baking oven after the bread has come out. or in winter into a stoves inside. Do not let it burn, but see that it burns very nicely crisp to the extent that it does not last because of the saffron. So we're making noodles. We're making spicy pasta. Keep them in a box in a dry place and they stay good for a quarter of a year or longer. When you have to make meat soup, throw 1 or 10 or 12 into it. And if you want to serve it, let it boil up 1 or 3 times. That way they swell up and the broth tastes very good. Even if it is not bad in itself, it becomes better still. Serve it over sauce. This recipe is all kinds of fascinating, and this is literally the only reference to this particular kind of spicy noodles that I have come across in German corpus, and I love it to bits. And that is her style. You can see her in the kitchen doing this. You can see her making reference to 1,000 recipes that she remembers, and the whole book is like that. It's also pretty big. It's almost 300 pages. That's it. Okay, it's like an almost 300-page book. So you will probably understand that my translation of it is probably not going to come out this year, but I am on it. I'm about 30% done. And that was our introduction to the sources of the German corpus. I haven't done all of them, but I've done all the important, all the significant ones. There is, we're not quite sure, but depending on how you count, there's anywhere between 60 and 100 different recipe sources from the German Middle Ages and Renaissance that survive to this day. Discrete sources, not reprints. So it's a big tradition. Okay, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Before the questions start, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
All right.
And then let me go ahead and do that.